So, time for Saturday evening's press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's papers. And tonight we'll see what's making the headlines with Rachel Shabi and also Claire Ellicott. But first of all, let's take a look at those front pages for you. We're going to begin with the People. Half of NHS docs in mental health crisis is on their front page as it looks at the developing situation for frontline medics. While the Observer looks at political responses to reports of an NHS crisis with the headline "Cabinet Split over NHS Pay piles pressure on Sunak." And the front of the Sunday Telegraph looks at Keir Starmer's stance on it all. Its headline, "I will slash nonsense bureaucracy in the NHS." Tory donor tycoons £4.5 million to destroy PPE, reads the front of the Sunday Mirror. They're exclusive. And the front of the Sunday Mail also looks at the Conservatives. Its headline, Tories' £2 million jackpot. Sex assault during riot at migrant centre, reads the front of the Sunday Express. While the Sunday Times looks to the Royals for their front page. The headline there, Windsor peace talk plan ahead of the coronation, I wonder. And don't forget that you can scan the QR code that you see on screen during the programme. You can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And tonight I'm joined by the journalist Rachel Shabi and Claire Ellicott, acting Deputy Political Editor of the Mail on Sunday. Great to see you this Saturday evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's get cracking, shall we? Rachel, why don't you kick things off for us? Front of the Sunday Telegraph, they have got an interview with Sir Keir Starmer, and he says he's going to slash bureaucracy in the NHS.
That's right. An incredibly disappointing interview, I have to say, from the Labour leader, who says, as you point out, the goal for a Labour government would be to slash what he describes as mind-boggling NHS bureaucracy. He says the service must, quote, reform or die, and he says that we need to move away from our, quote, well-meaning reverence towards the NHS, an attitude which he claims has supplanted reality. Now, this is unfortunate because the reality, according to the people who work in the NHS, is not that we have some kind of fantasy view of it or that it is overtly bureaucratic, but rather that it has been underfunded, systematically underfunded through 12 years of Conservative rule. Keir Starmer knows that because Keir Starmer knows the last time the Labour Party was in government, we didn't have these problems. It was receiving more funding as percentage of GDP, waiting lists were shorter, staffing was higher. At the moment, what people who actually work in the NHS are talking about is the underfunding, is the underinvestment, is the lack of staffing, and the fact that social care is also on its knees due to underfunding, so that the hospitals, the NHS service is only really working to two-thirds bed capacity because the other third is taken up by people who are fit to be discharged but can't because social care packages are in place. So it's just nonsense and frankly insulting for the Labour leader to make these claims about the NHS, particularly when people who actually work in the NHS are saying something very, very different.
Interesting, Claire. What do you make of what Rachel had to say there?
Well, I think there are several really interesting things about this piece being in the Telegraph. And clearly Sir Keir Starmer is sort of parking his tanks on the Tories' lawn, because this is something Steve Barclay was talking about just a few weeks ago about slashing bureaucracy. It's a very standard sort of Tory approach to these things. How do you save money? You cut all the red tape that's holding back these services. And the fact that Keir Starmer's saying it, and we've had him recently talking about taking back control and, you know, just saying a lot of sort of like Tory things. He's clearly in election mode. He's clearly looking to win over some of those voters that haven't been voting for Labour, that have defected to the Tories in recent times. Now, his message on the NHS in, you know, the Tory Bible, the Telegraph, will go down like a cup of sick for many of the Labour voters who really do treasure the NHS. But I can see how Keir Starmer would think this was a key thing for him to do in order to win back some of those voters that the Labour Party lost in 2019.
OK, well, let's stay with the NHS and the front of the Observer, Rachel. There's been some breaking news tonight. The Royal College of Nursing ramping up the pressure, saying it's going to announce fresh strikes for February, which could be many more nurses going on strike than we're going to see next week. Meanwhile, the Observer is reporting that there's a split over how to resolve the issue, with actually Steve Barclay coming out more on the side of nurses, but the Treasury are holding back.
That's right. So the Observer is reporting this sort of slight twist in the story, which is, as you say, Health Secretary Steve Barclay privately saying that there really should be more money for nurses, ambulance workers and other essential workers within the NHS. According to this story, he is at odds with both the Treasury and the Prime Minister, both of whom want to hold out, essentially, and face down these strikes. But what's interesting is that Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, is actually asking the unions now to help him make the case. He wants them to lean in on the idea that actually more pay would avoid this huge drain of staff that's happening in the NHS at the moment. There's this big exodus, partly because people are burnt out and stressed, which we'll look at in a minute, but also partly because the pay is so appalling and the training is so appalling. And so his big claim here, or his big sort of his methodology here, is that he wants to lean on that premise to try and get more money out of the Treasury and actually pay nurses and other NHS workers more.
Yeah, I mean, where's it all going, Claire? I mean, at the start of the week, on Monday, there seemed to be some movement between the two sides, didn't there? There seemed to be positive noises coming out of discussions. But here we are at the end of the week, no further forward.
Yes, exactly, and further strikes threatened, as you point out. And I think the interesting thing about this briefing is it's come from the union, so I'm not quite sure what Steve Barclay's take on it is. But there is this sort of interesting idea that as a Tory, you think probably that you don't want to spend loads more money and taxpayers' money on services if they're not necessarily getting better. But once you're in a department and you're being told that you need to find money out of your existing budget to pay for pay rises for workers, your perspective probably changes a bit. And this story has suggested that Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, is pitted against Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt in the Treasury, and that they're pressing back and they don't want to make these huge commitments. I wonder if it's a case of good cop, bad cop. But like you say, things are dragging on and unions are threatening further strikes. So the sooner there can be some sort of solution to this, the better.
Yeah, OK. I've just realised that all our front pages, certainly in the first half of the paper review, are about the health service in some form or another. The front of the Sunday People, half of NHS doctors in mental health crisis. It's a very depressing headline, Rachel. You've read further online.
That's right. So it's incredibly depressing, but I suppose unsurprising that people working inside the NHS are suffering with their own health problems and their own mental health problems. 52% suffer poor mental health, and panic attacks are happening amongst people who previously had no history of anxiety. Of course, it's not hard to see why. The conditions that NHS workers are working so hard in are appalling, short-staffed for one, but just the stress of having to work in conditions where you're constantly unable essentially to do your job. Imagine that these industries are care industries, and the absolute stress of not being able to do what you need to do to help people, the fact that you're needing to treat people and care for people in hospital corridors, the fact that you're an ambulance worker that's waiting hours outside an A&E because there's not enough space to bring in the patient that you're trying to look after or potentially try to save their life. So it's really no wonder that these staff are essentially facing so much stress and it's affecting their mental health.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Let's move on just very briefly, Claire, to the Sunday Mirror. Just tell us about this story. It's regarding a Tory donor and PPE contracts.
Yes, so this is quite a controversial story. Someone who's donated £730,000 to the Tory party he won a huge contract for millions of pounds of PPE and is now being paid to essentially get rid of all this PPE. Now, this feeds into the wider scandal of money being wasted on all of these huge contracts during the pandemic. And there's a lasting legacy. There's millions and millions of pounds worth of taxpayers' money that was spent on a lot of this PPE equipment. And quite a lot of it wasn't actually usable, but it was commissioned in sort of the heat of the pandemic when people were desperate, that ministers were desperate to get hold of masks. There was a worldwide battle to try to secure some of this stuff. But it's clear that real mistakes were made, and this is just the latest example. We've had Michelle Mone, the Tory peer, caught up in all sorts of scandal. I think she stepped away from the Lords as a result of it. And it's just an ongoing saga, and we'll sort of probably never know quite how much money was wasted in securing all of these contracts, some of which were ultimately useless.
Yeah, no response on the front page, at least from that donor. We'll try and get his side of it maybe in the next hour. Thank you both for now. We're going to go to a break. Coming up, this story on the front of the Times. Its headline, Windsor Peace Talk Plan ahead of coronation. Talking about that and more after the break. Welcome back. Rachel and Claire still with us for the press preview. Claire, front of the Sunday Telegraph, all the papers reporting on the execution of Ali Reza Akbari. What's the Telegraph's take?
So they're saying that the British response to this may be that they pull out of the nuclear deal that is supposed to be going ahead. Now, the saga with this is that he is a British-Iranian dual national. He's executed. Iran have accused him of being an MI6 spy, and the British government have sort of been taken by surprise by this in some ways, and they've kind of had a reaction today. They have sanctioned the Prosecutor General in Iran. They have summoned the ambassador from Iran, and they've recalled our ambassador to Tehran to temporarily to speak to the foreign secretary in Britain. And so this is their reaction at the moment, but it's clear that that's not quite big enough given what's actually happened, and so they're going to need to go further with this. There's a lot of discussion about what they might do, whether they might pull out of the nuclear deal. This is something that's been brokered for a long time and could have huge implications, or whether they prescribe the Revolutionary Guard who run Tehran as a terrorist group. That's something that could happen, but it's not sounding that likely. But whatever happens, they're going to have to take a kind of more hardline stance on this. And the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is due to go to the US next week and have speak to his counterparts there. So whether there's a UK-US sort of response to this as a result, we will probably find out quite soon.
Yeah, it's a difficult line, isn't it, Rachel, for Britain to tread? But quite frankly, the diplomatic moves made today, recalling the ambassador from Tehran temporarily, sanctions on the Prosecutor General in Iran, I mean, they're going to make no impact.
Well, yeah, it is a difficult line to tread, as you say, and the worry is, of course, that this is a horrendous act, and the worry is, of course, that this might be sending out a warning signal to protesters in Iran and perhaps others in Iran, saying, "Look, these are the things that we're prepared to do." So it is absolutely chilling. The trouble is, of course, that having some impact or taking some act to wind back commitments to the Iran deal is going to have global consequences. It might be a bit sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face in terms of its ramifications. But I think there are definitely avenues to pursue in terms of how on earth did this even even happen legally? What are the legal consequences? Can anyone be brought to justice, or can in an international court, just for what happened? And it is an absolutely appalling act. So yes, of course, that does need to see some consequences.
OK, let's move on to Harry and the Royals, shall we? Something which I think the Daily Mail may have covered a little bit, Claire, over the last couple of weeks. Sunday Times has got this story about a peace talk plan having to take place before the coronation. I mean, is that likely, given everything that Harry has said in his book?
Well, you would struggle if you were the royal family, wouldn't you, to envision this? But nevertheless, there are said to be plans afoot to try to reunite the warring factions of Windsor. The coronation takes place in May. There's not that much time to engineer a reconciliation, given quite how seismic some of the revelations in Harry's book Spare have been. Nevertheless, they are, Prince Charles, King Charles now, has signalled that he does want to engineer some sort of reconciliation with his son. And there's a big question now as to whether Prince Harry and Meghan will be invited, and what exactly happens and the implications of that. And I'd imagine if you are a royal courtier at the moment, that is taking up an awful lot of your time. Nevertheless, there has to be some sort of rapprochement, because it's just rocked the nation, hasn't it? And it's huge. And I think everyone would probably like to see something positive happen with this family.
Yeah, quick thought, Rachel?
I mean, I think it's just about the king not wanting to have his coronation sort of put off track by more and more stories coming from Harry, who shows no intention of stopping. And I guess even people who are on team Harry and Meghan are kind of thinking, all right, this is getting a little bit too much now, just too much information. And perhaps the royal family's approach of, oh, if we say nothing, it will go away. Perhaps they've realized that actually Harry's just going to keep talking unless some move towards reconciliation.
Yeah, he says he's got another book in him, doesn't he? Or certainly he kept a lot of information out. OK, thank you both.